let's continue our conversation then as we make sense of how best we can protect young people in this country, children to be more specific. Michelle Craig, once again, live to us from the Teaddy Clinic in Johannesburg today. And Michelle, there are organizations that have worked tirelessly not only to educate the public about ways through which we can assist children, but also to try and empower those who are entrusted with their care to protect them as best as they can.
Yeah, good morning to you once again, Ayanda. Absolutely. I mean, that issue is such an important one that you raised there, providing families with the skills that they need to cope with situations that can lead to violence. Children in our country face an uphill battle to just exist, to just be safe. So many barriers to their safety. Violence, child-headed homes, gender-based violence is included in that, poor access to healthcare and education, child trafficking. I kicked off this segment on our show, this special focus that we're doing on the AM report this morning on violence against children in our country by giving you some incredibly worrying numbers. And I want to just reiterate them today because they help us paint a picture of just how devastating this threat to South Africa's children is. In April to June of this year, that's in a 90-day period, according to the crime statistics, 243 children were murdered. Just let that sink in for a moment. 1,670, almost 1,700 children were victims of assault GBH in that same period. That's a 58% jump on the previous year. That's the national picture. We bring it back to Gauteng. In the first 3 months of this year, 45 children in this province murdered, according to the crime statistics. That's an 80% increase in child murders compared to the same period last year. In fact, just today, in the course of this ordinary Thursday for you and me, at least 3 children will have their lives violently cut short. I'm going to bring in the Teddy Bear Clinic's Director Shahida Omar. Shahida, it gives us a sense, good morning, of the threat to the safety of our children.
Indeed, I think working with children and just dealing with so many manifestations of anxiety and fear, what we're seeing that we're actually going to find a nation of children who are growing up to be adults with generalized anxiety disorders because of the fear of safety and the violence that they are surrounded by, the uncertainty, the instability in their environment. I think this is something that we are really concerned about. And we are dealing with many children who are acting out. So we're seeing children who are becoming victimizers. You're seeing the bullying, you're seeing the cyberbullying, you're seeing these aggressive outbursts which one cannot explain. And children that are also manifesting depression. A lot of therapists that are working with children who are depressed. And we are seeing children as young as 8 years old who are displaying signs of depression. And children, we've dealt with children who have attempted suicide and completed suicide at the age of 9. And I think this is something that one needs to be very concerned about and look at ways of how can we protect our children, how can we counteract these kind of challenges that we are currently faced with.
And you talk about having a whole generation of children that are traumatized, right? It also talks to this continuous cycle of violence in our country because the victims become perpetrators. Is that fair to say?
Indeed. So what we're seeing, that there's a two-sided approach to this. The victims either become victimizers to assume that sense of power and control, identify with the aggressor, or the victims continue to remain victims and gravitate towards relationships where they will continue to be victimized. I think these are things that we need to be concerned about because even with the gender-based violence that we are speaking to as a national pandemic which affects everybody globally, we are deeply affected by that, where children are acting out, they're growing up to be, the perpetrators, or where they're growing up to be victims. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed urgently.
Of course, the levels of violence against children in South Africa takes on a specific nuance because so often, I mean, is it fair to say most often, that violence initiates in the home?
So you are absolutely correct, because where are children exposed to violence? And children are mirroring what they're living by, what they're exposed to. It's a socially conditioned response. So usually it's at home where there's domestic violence, this culture of violence, even in terms of discipline, where discipline is confused with corporal punishment. So they are subjected to physical abuse and internalize what they are subjected to. And of course, later on, assimilate that in their behavioral repertoire. And you alluded to the intergenerational patterns of violence, that cycle of violence which perpetuates itself. But we also need to look at the neighborhood violence, the culture of violence. And even if we look, it's a systemic issue here. It's systemic challenges that we face with. We cannot isolate one single risk factor. There's multiple factors that we need to consider. So it's the home environment, it's the neighborhood, it's the lack of recreational facilities, living in overcrowded settings, access to resources. You spoke to healthcare facilities, education being in crisis, where not each and every child is attending school. It's easier for a child to be raped than to learn to read. And I think that is something that we have to be concerned about. So if we look at the adversities that children are facing, they're exposed to substance abuse, they are exposed to explicit media, which is age inappropriate, which is often something they're not in a position to process, to understand, and they're not in a position to ask the relevant questions because they don't have a platform, a permission to engage in those dialogues. Because often we find that parents are very strapped for time. They're working, they leave home early hours of the morning, come back in the evening. They're doing what they have to do, provide for the needs, basic needs, food and shelter and security for the child. That emotional and physical investment in checking out where the child is at, what is happening in the here and now. I think those are things that actually does not always happen.
Yeah. I mean, Shahida, I think you and I have been having this conversation for almost 20 years now. And we don't seem to be getting a grip on this. In fact, it seems to be spiraling. What do we need to do in our country, especially because from a policing point of view, violence in the home is incredibly difficult. Police are more responsive to violence in the home. Where are we going wrong here, Shahida?
So, this is a very difficult question, but a very important question, because I think we're failing to work with each other. We're working in our own pockets and silos in isolation. There isn't connection, interaction with each other. The different government departments, whether it's education, social development, law enforcement, justice, even CSOs, NGOs, all the different stakeholders and role players. There's pockets of excellence. People have got wonderful programs, interventions, promising interventions, but the lack of connection and a lack of communication results in a very fragmented approach where we're not going to get results, because you're going to see that because of this disjointedness, we find that things are not working. And we need to have this coordination, collaboration to integrate the supportive services, the resources, but we also need to bring the victims and the people on the ground that are actually exposed and subjected to this violence, to hear from them. What would make them feel safe? What would they like to see happen? And I think if we just cast our mind to the recent gender-based violence summit, the second presidential summit, where children have actually been brought into this platform for the first time, and hearing from them, their worries, their concerns, their anxieties, and how would they like to see things evolve, emerge, and change. I think those are things that would be clear guidelines on what to do and to bring everybody together to work collectively. It's a collective effort. We cannot do it single-handedly.
Shahida Omar is the director, clinical director here at the Teddy Bear Clinic. I mean, the one thing that Shahida says there that stands out in a number of things that you've said to us this morning, just outlining this problem. It's easier for a child in South Africa to be raped than to learn to read. Ayanda, it's back to you.
Yeah, really sobering that, isn't it? Michelle Craig, thanks very much indeed. Live to us there from the Teddy Bear Clinic.